I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're trying to figure out why there are Mario enemies in my Zelda game, as I rank the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. If there's one thing I really adore about Zelda's fourth outing, it's that every dungeon had a distinct identity, despite being on that monochromatic Game Boy color. So the Switch remake really enhances their differences aesthetically, but even the gameplay of each dungeon tends to be focused around different mechanics that make them feel fresh and unique. We'll be looking at the 8 dungeons containing the Instruments of the Sirens, as well as the Color dungeon added in the DX update. I will not be ranking Dampé's Shack dungeons, they're just amalgamations of the already existing rooms in actual dungeons, and I will not be ranking Inside the Windfish's Egg. It's one puzzle and then the boss, it's not worth ranking. And fair warning, this is a video filled with hot takes. Link's Awakening fans, you might want to look away now. With that being said, all 9 Link's Awakening dungeons ranked. Let me know your favorite down below. Coming in last place, I'm about to offend every single Zelda fan ever. We have number 9, Catfish is More. When I rank dungeons, I have to take into account the enemy variety, aesthetic, puzzles, and challenges. In Catfish is More, while I think the aesthetics work really well and the enemy variety is great, there's one major factor of this dungeon that really halts my enjoyment, in a way none of the other dungeons on this list do. The dungeon item, the hookshot, which is amazing by the way, it never isn't, is obtained by defeating the Master Stalfos mini-boss. Only, you have to fight this guy 4 different times throughout the dungeon. He'll appear very early on in your playthrough, and slashing him to knock him to pieces so you can bomb him to smithereens does the job. Only he'll flee and you have to find the next arena he spawns in. The order is denoted by the tile patterns on the floor, but it means you're running back and forth throughout the whole dungeon to find him, which I don't find particularly fun. It's unique, and I totally understand people who find this concept of a roaming mini-boss novel and enjoyable. I know I'm in the minority here. But I think the idea of searching for an enemy throughout the dungeon works better in the 3D games, where the visuals spice up the experience more. Think the Poe sisters in the Forest Temple. In the 2D games, it just doesn't have the same je ne sais quoi to it. There's also a mini-boss battle against Gohma here, which is confusing because it's not mandatory, and can only be beaten if you purchase the bow from the shop in Mabe Village. Having 2 different ways to reach the dungeon boss is certainly unique, but to me it feels like very random level design when none of the other dungeons feature an optional mini-boss like this. Catfish is More bucks trends, and I do enjoy a lot of the hookshot puzzles and how it differentiates itself from the other water dungeon, but it's the one I least look forward to playing on any given run, and it does the least for me aesthetically. At least it has one of the more complex and difficult boss fights of the game with the Slime Eel, whose deadly tail and tricky faces can lead to a brutal battle. Definitely the high point of the dungeon and a great way to end. It's not bad by any means, easily top 60% of the franchise, it's just my personal preference at the end of the day. Speaking of water dungeons, at number 8, we have Angler's Tunnel. The positives: I love this dungeon's aesthetic. The watery cavern with the green moss and the serene ambiance is exactly my kind of feel. The puzzle design has you exploring the whole dungeon, which is a lot of fun, with a lot of tricky jumps and water platforming in the first half, while the second half of the dungeon opens up once you get the flippers and you're able to swim at your leisure. The water that once was a problem is now simple to wade through. I also like that the key that falls down a gap into an underwater area fairly early on. It's the use of 2D space that I really enjoy. On the flip side though, I'm not the biggest fan of the overall dungeon layout. Some of the rooms don't feel exciting to run through, there's no easy way to and from the entrance of the dungeon until after you've killed the pretty cool mini-boss, so if you're like me and you missed something, you'll be running back and forth a lot. There are other dungeons that remain tricky to navigate but constantly push the player forwards. I often found myself at a loss in the Angler's Tunnel, which is a shame. There's a now great boss waiting at the end that fits the themes of the tunnel spectacularly as long as you're playing the Switch version, and the use of water throughout is a key component of why this dungeon lands above the Catfish's Maw, which also seemed like it would be a water-based dungeon based on the location, but then really wasn't. That being said, and this may be the biggest death knell to the Angler's Tunnel in the Switch edition, I really dislike the remake's rendition of the dungeon theme. We didn't need the original tracks spliced in with the gorgeous new arrangement. Cut those beeps and boops, it was so distracting I'm almost embarrassed to admit it. A dungeon needs to have good music or I'm not going to want to stay in there, and Angler's Tunnel was the only one in the remake that just completely missed the mark. From this point on, I love every dungeon in the game. So don't hate me, you probably will. At number 7, we have Turtle Rock. The lava theme feels right at home for the last sprawling layer you explore, and even comes with its own mini-boss to earn the right to enter the dungeon. Once inside, you'll be exploring various pathways until you can progress no further, followed by a lot of warping back to the dungeon entrance. It's never quite clear what path leads to progression here in Turtle Rock, but that is part of the charm. You might accidentally run into a mini-boss, given the place is chock full of them, or you'll find the compass, or a stairway leading outside to the top of the mountain range. The main gimmick are these movable platforms which you can use to fill in pits and create paths across lava. I think they're cool and far more interesting than some puzzles in this series. But the platforms in the first lava room got very tiring very quickly because you'd have to take one path, see what's there, likely go the wrong way, and then have to work your way back around to the start of the dungeon to try a different path. It gets tedious. The magic rod is a fine item to obtain here. It's mainly used in 2D segments to melt ice, which has a few fun puzzling uses. Nothing to write home about in comparison to items like the hookshot though, or the roc's feather. I didn't get lost quite as much in Turtle Rock in the remake compared to the original Game Boy edition, and I really enjoy how it feels like this long gauntlet you have to overcome. Those just never happen to be my favourite type of dungeon though, and I think some of the other levels have a bit more of an identity outside of being the token lava dungeon. Also, the Blano mini-boss can punch you back to the dungeon entrance, which is royally screwed up, and the main boss Hothead is a complete letdown given how many of the enemies and mini-bosses you fought to reach him are that much harder. I'd rather take a whole room filled with Vyres than fight Hothead again. At number 6, we have the novel and innovative Color Dungeon. This location trades the sprawling large dungeon complexes for a more puzzling series of trials. Everything revolves around color because this was not a dungeon in the original game. It was added in the DX version of Link's Awakening for the Game Boy Color, and to enter the dungeon, you had to correctly identify the colors of the guards standing outside. Obviously on Switch that's not an issue, so you head on in and you have classic Switch puzzles where you need to match the colors, enemies that you can chuck into colored holes, breakable platforms that start off green but eventually make their way to red with enough damage, multiple dangerous mini-bosses to fight, such as the giant buzz blob, which I regret to admit almost killed me, and the stone Hinox, which proved a mighty challenge. Neither leans into the color aspect of the dungeon, but both prove to be far more formidable than most of the base game mini-bosses. I just wish the color dungeon had a more expansive layout. The reward is so tantalizing that the team could have gotten away with designing more for the Switch remake, as being able to double your damage or half damage taken via the red and blue mail definitely breaks the late game. But at the end of the day, I've always preferred puzzles when it comes to Zelda. It's why for the Oracle games, I actually prefer ages over seasons. And it's why even though Turtle Rock is an expansive navigation challenge in this game, I prefer the puzzles of the Color Dungeon, and for me, that's more than enough to justify its ranking. Also, the boss of this dungeon gaslights the player, and I think that's fucking funny. At number 5, we have Tail Cave, the first dungeon of the game, and the first proper Zelda dungeon I recall completing as a child. Which makes sense. The layout of the cavern is extremely simple, but gives players the illusion of choice. You can head left to complete a 2-room optional path for the compass. You can get the map early on as well by heading to the room with the rotating one-way door. But the moment you make it to the large central room, the game will force you to the upper part of the dungeon on the path to the Roc's Feather. It's possible to visit this odd little room with these slot machine style enemies, but it's not required. They give you the stone beak item, which is new to Link's Awakening though. Each dungeon has one, and you can use it on owl statues to hear hints on how to progress. I like the use of the shield on these spinies in this room to reveal the stairs, and racing through against the moving sparks in this area is a nice early game challenge. Once you obtain the Roc's Feather, you can reach the dungeon's mini-boss and the Nightmare Key, and the battle against Rolling Bones is one of the more memorable mini-boss encounters in the game. I love getting him trapped in a cycle where he can't pass me. This leads to the boss Moldorm, who is far improved from their appearance in A Link to the Past. You can check out my boss ranking video from last week for more details, but I will say it's a great way to end the dungeon. However, I think the mini-boss and the boss coming one after the other sets up a weird element of pacing that other dungeons improve upon. And also for some reason, Tail Cave is the only dungeon you have to revisit after you finish it in-game. There's a bombable wall containing a secret seashell, and I'm just not a big fan of revisiting past dungeons for collectibles. It takes me so out of the way, both here and in Ocarina of Time with the golden sculptures, and is just a personal pet peeve. Missing out on the top 3, we have number 4, the Face Shrine, the 6th dungeon of the game. And before we even get into the dungeon itself, I have to mention the absolute god-tier music it was blessed with. Right before you face this dungeon, Link discovers the truth that Koholint Island is but a dream. And as you enter the Face Shrine, that realization stays with you. It haunts you. And then you hear this music track that absolutely encompasses that haunting nature. This is one of the few tracks in the game that really benefits from having the original Game Boy's theme remixed into the new arrangement, creating an ambiance that none of the other dungeons have. If this were an aesthetic ranking, Face Shrine wins hands down, and this is easily the best track on the OST. As for the dungeon itself, I'd say this is one of the few that requires the most exploration to uncover its secrets. Whether you head left or right, you've got things to uncover. An endless hallway, the return of the 2D Zelda classic Wizrobes, the clever utilization of the red and blue switches, which make up a majority of this dungeon's puzzle design, and even a hidden secret seashell you can find by finding a hidden exit in the dungeon leading up to the river rapids. The magenta aesthetic of the ruined floors works with the addition of enemies like flying tiles, and the giant elephant statues hide the true path ahead as you'll need the powerful bracelet to make any progress here. This is one of the few dungeons where I got genuinely lost, and yet it feels surprisingly fun to navigate. Perhaps I just prefer the enemy variety, or maybe I like how the dungeon can be split into its western and eastern half. It makes me think. But unlike a Turtle Rock that feels more labyrinthian in nature, the Face Shrine has more clearly defined paths to take. The challenge is just finding them. Then the boss is hilariously on theme for the dungeon, Facade being a breath of fresh air who actively tries to stop you from using your bombs in the first half of the fight, before becoming a bit of a pushover once he runs out of tiles and bottles to chuck your way. This is the true turning point of Link's Awakening, and I totally understand why some consider it their favourite dungeon, but I just prefer the exploration of the 3 dungeons above. It's a new year, new me, but we're still trying to reach 20,000 subscribers by the summer of 2024, and I know we can do it. Just look at how many of you aren't subscribed yet. Let's rectify that. Be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all of my future content. Back to the video. At number 3, we have the Bottle Grotto, the 2nd dungeon of the game. Now, I know this isn't a popular choice among the fanbase, but if you'll allow me an opportunity to share a story with you all, perhaps this ranking will make more sense. The first time I played Link's Awakening, I made it to the Bottle Grotto and found myself really enjoying the dungeon. using color switches to open up paths, encountering those weird enemies that mimicked your movement, and realizing the dungeon was shaped exactly like a bottle, mind-blowing. I took on the High Nox mini-boss, which was a much more engaging challenge than the mini-boss of the prior dungeon, and his placement right at the center of the complex meant that the warp was a little more useful. I found the power bracelet and began picking up pots, using them to defeat Pole's voices, returning to the start of the dungeon to grab the chest in the entrance room, and even finding the nightmare door. But I could never find the key. I missed the owl that gave you the hint as to how to collect the nightmare key, and ultimately dropped the game for a few years. It beat me, until I came back a few years later and figured out that genius puzzle where you have to kill 3 enemies in a specific order in a specific room to receive your prize. It's such an obtuse puzzle on paper, but the solution can be discovered if you collect the owl beak to the left of the dungeon entrance and check one of the owl statues. This puzzle actively asks the player to engage with this hint mechanic, making it more useful, and I love that. Then the dungeon boss is the perfect fight for the theme, a genie in a bottle which you need to smash while avoiding his fireballs, before dealing with his unleashed form once the bottle shatters. It's a great challenge that caps off a dungeon that I spent so much time exploring as a kid that even though it's linear, just hits different for me every time I enter. And number 2, we have Key Cavern. And of all the dungeons in this game, this is the one that shot up in my estimations upon my latest replay, because as a kid, I recall vividly hating this dungeon with a passion. What do you mean I have to find a bunch of keys? Why are there so many paths to take? This boss sucks. Yet, as an adult with the power of hindsight, I can see just how impressive this dungeon is with its layout. You start off in a linear segment at the bottom of the dungeon. The only way to progress is to collect a key and head downwards where you're met with 4 locked doors. 3 of them lead to rooms where you'll need to complete them to collect a fresh key and try again, while 1 actually leads to the rest of the dungeon. I got lucky and picked the right door on this playthrough to progress, leading to the upper half of the dungeon, but I really like that little concept they introduced there. The upper half of the dungeon is a gigantic circle, where you're able to actually see most of the rooms from this handy upper walkway. It makes surveying where you need to go a lot of fun, and naturally the path leading to the boss is also locked off by a variety of unlockable blocks. The Dodongo snakes aren't my favourite mini-boss in the world, but their weird design and odd audio cues definitely make them memorable. Defeating them grants a warp to the start of the dungeon, which makes backtracking really simple, as you'll need to head back to the start to collect a spare key and some rupees in a chest, after collecting the Pegasus boots from the room next door to the Dodongo snakes. Easily one of the best items in the game, Pegasus boots grant Link such a speed boost that makes traversing the world much quicker, and using them to pop these jelly-like boulders was a surprise my first time around in the remake, because I just never figured that was the consistency of these obstacles. They seemed so solid in the Game Boy. And just to ensure there's no soft locking, the developers added 1 extra key than was needed to ensure players couldn't get themselves stuck while opening doors. Sure, the boss is a letdown, but it does use the dungeon item well and can be finished relatively quickly. I just think this dungeon segments itself rather well, and has a complete, fully realized identity that some of the other dungeons in this game, in my opinion, lack. It may be confusing with all the keys, and it's not to everybody's taste, but for me, that's part of the fun. And at number 1, we have, what else was it gonna be? The Eagle's Tower. The 7th dungeon of the game. I always love when Zelda takes a crack at vertical level design. Dungeons where the focus is on going back and forth across different floors to make your way to the top. It's a classic fantasy dungeon trope. And yet, the Eagle's Tower offers you a conundrum. To make it to the boss, you have to not only explore each of the floors, solving puzzles with coloured switches, battling your way through various enemies, including rooms with flying tiles, and even the dreaded anti-Kirby, but upon finding a large ball in the centre of the 2nd floor, you have to use it to destroy 4 supports holding up the higher floors of the tower. That's right. To reach the boss, you have to #renovate and #demolish an entire floor. You can fight the Grim Creeper mini-boss early if you make it to floor 3. The boss door and the instrument of the siren held here are only accessible after solving the large ball puzzle. Navigating the second floor with the orb, chucking it across gaps, and trying to figure out the optimal path is very addictive. Sure, the navigation can be a pain to players who aren't into vertical level design, and that's totally cool, but this is very much my kind of exploration. I mean, my favorite Link to the Past dungeon was the Ice Palace. While Turtle Rock, Catfish's Moor, and the Face Shrine were all exploration-focused dungeons with a lot of back and forth, they don't have the dynamics of a second floor and a third floor, one where you can fall down holes to drop to the floor below, potentially landing near hidden chests or other secrets. And what of the boss, the Evil Eagle? Another well-designed fight for the dungeon, and one of the 2D side-scroller boss battles that is actually pretty difficult if you don't know how to manage it. It's the dungeon with the most scope in terms of its layout and main gimmick, and it's impressive this was able to fit on a little Game Boy cartridge back in the day. Well worth the title of the best dungeon in Link's Awakening. And that's my list. Which of these dungeons is your favorite? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all my future gaming content. Ocarina of Time is next. My socials are on screen now. Feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter, my Blue Sky, or my Discord, whatever you're into. A massive shout out to my patrons on Patreon for supporting me for another month. You guys are amazing, and I will see you guys next time. Adios.